It is my distinct honor today to introduce Miss Anna Collard. She's an advocate and she's the Senior Vice President of Content and Strategy at Know Before Africa. Now, I could go through an exhaustive list of all her accomplishments and awards, but I think just highlighting two of them will more than do the job. She was honored by the ISACA and IFSEC, and she was listed on their list of global influencers in security for last year. Please welcome Miss Anna Collard.
Thank you, Keith. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone for taking the time today. Let me quickly share my screen. And then maybe one last check, just if you could confirm that you can hear me all right and you can see the slides and everything. I assume it's all okay? All right. Okay, well, thank you so much for the opportunity, for being here today. I'm going to talk about ransomware and cyber extortion. And just because of the company that I represent, before we focus on the human element, so we focus on training employees and staff of organizations on how to navigate safer online. I do have a personal interest in the human behind the criminals as well. So I'm going to share a couple of trends, also a little bit about behind the scenes of these syndicates and these criminals that we're dealing with. Then there's some findings that we've recently conducted a survey with ITWeb across South African organizations and the impact of cyber extortion on our sort of ecosystem. And then lastly, obviously some tips on what we can do to defend ourselves against this threat. So, obviously being a woman in tech, I'd like to introduce, or find women in tech, other women, and unfortunately, even in the crime space, we do have some. So I'd like to introduce you to a lady called Ella Witter. She was part of what's called the TrickBot Crime as a Service group. She's a developer there. She's currently sitting in prison, quite rightly so. She was sort of coined as the mother of some of the younger members of both the Conti network and the TrickBot Crime as a Service group. So you do get, we sometimes the media represents ransomware actors or cyber criminals as just these teenagers with hoodies on top, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Obviously, it is quite male dominated, but you can find all sorts of people involved. It really is like any other business ecosystem. Here's another example of a gentleman or a person called Mikhail Pavlovich Matviev. I don't know if I pronounce this correctly, but he is more, think of him as like a contractor that works with a couple of groups, and he basically sort of sells his services or his support to these groups, and also acts like an affiliate. And then the worst of them all in terms of cyber criminals is really our esteemed leader, Jim, what's his name? The supreme leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, who, and this is fascinating if you think how North Korea is obviously sanctioned to the max, so they can't really create any revenue through legitimate means. So how do they support a nuclear weapon system or nuclear weapon program? Well, through criminal activities. And one of the crime areas that they've identified as being highly lucrative is the cybercrime space. And if we consider that if you happen to be a child of maybe 10, 11 years old and you show any sort of talent in the math or STEM fields, what happens is that you get picked out of school. You are being selected basically to participate in a special forces unit where they prepare you to become a member of the Cyber Warrior group, which is a state-sponsored hacking group. These kids are then shipped off to China because in North Korea there's not enough internet bandwidth or connectivity, and then they share apartments in China under the threat of something is going to happen to their family members if they escape, and they literally have to hack and conduct criminal activities for the state. So to collect money in illegitimate means for North Korean state. If you do yourself a favor, if you haven't listened to it yet, there's a fantastic podcast series called The Lazarus Heist by the BBC, where these journalists literally follow one of the incidents that involved these North Korean hacking groups, or the Lazarus group, and they explain how they managed to steal. Well, they were meant to steal $1 billion from the Bank of India. They managed to steal, I think it was 200 million, and it's incredible how financially motivated these groups are, that are basically working for a state to not just obtain intellectual property, but to actually steal money and support the nuclear weapon system. So we're dealing with some pretty scary threat actors, I'd say, and the ransomware syndicates, or the organized crime units, obviously also in it for the money. But this is also a quote by Matveyev, who says there's no such money anywhere as there's in ransomware. He's actually not quite right, because if you look at the impact in terms of cybercrime, the typical sort of business email compromise, or what's called authorized push payment fraud, is causing more damage to the industry than the ransomware guys are doing. But it's a pretty lucrative business, and we'll see now why that is. If you look at the actual ecosystem, typically we'll have sort of an operator, which is the core team that creates the actual software behind these malicious software pieces. They look after the infrastructure and maintain it, and then they also look after what's called the shaming sites. And the Conti group was one of those. They don't exist anymore, but that was a really interesting case study, because all their internal chats were leaked, and it obviously allowed researchers, it's like a treasure trove for researchers to learn about how these people communicate, what they're saying, how they operate, etc. So the Conti group was one of these these syndicates, quite a large syndicate, and they then work with a so-called channel or partner network that they call affiliates, and the affiliates pay as sort of commission fee to the core team in order to use their services and their systems. And then there's actually a third group in the mix called the initial access brokers, and what they do is they literally just compromise credentials and try and get access into environments. They then don't do anything necessarily with those credentials, but they sell these lists of compromised accounts or access pathways to the operators. And then you have to picture this. It's a little bit like a direct marketing call center environment, where you have these operators that go through lists of already compromised accounts, and then after the fact, they've already got a way in, and only then do they determine if it's worth their while to move further in that compromised account. So it's not necessarily, which the media sometimes portrays as this big game hunting and these sophisticated kind of attacks, even though they exist, particularly with the North Koreans. But the ransomware or cyber extortion ecosystem is still quite opportunistic, with these people going through literally lists of compromised credentials. And then in terms of how are they organized, or similar to any other tech startup a little bit, you have a leadership team. And then this is again from the Conti leaks that we could determine. And then you have different departments, each department with its own budget. Some of them are responsible for sort of reverse engineering security tools to find ways in. Others are, they sort of specialize in the pen testing and the hacking and how to move laterally in an environment once they got into the first initial access point or through that. And then you also have like HR teams or personnel teams that are quite busy, because you can imagine, even for us in the sort of legitimate business, it's difficult to find technical talent, and the syndicates have the same problem, that they need to attract and then also retain software engineers and other technical talent. by the way, I thought what was really interesting is that they don't actually get paid that much. So if you start as a sort of low-level engineer in a syndicate like Conti, you were paid between $1,000 and $2,000 in cryptocurrency a month, and that's not a lot even for emerging countries, And then they have third parties that they work with, that they outsource, for example, the spamming and the phishing operations. So this is sort of how a typical larger ransomware syndicate is organized. They, like I mentioned, Conti doesn't exist anymore. Whether that is because of the leaks, I'm not sure, but they're a little bit, this whole system is a little bit like the Hydra, that Greek mythology, where once you cut one head off, 8 new ones pop up. And it's the same in the space, is that a lot of the leaders are actually the same, and they just move around and then form partnerships with other groups. They also sometimes compete and steal from each other, but they change all the time or rebrand all the time, and that obviously makes it also more difficult from a law enforcement point of view to get behind them and lock them up. The folks at Orange Cyber Defense, they do a fantastic job in monitoring what's called the so-called public shaming sites. So what happens is, if you happen to become infected or affected by ransomware or cyber extortion and you don't pay, what they do is to put extra pressure on their victims, is to publicize that incident on their shaming sites. And the Orange Cyber Defense team, they monitor these sites, and then they publish quarterly reports, which are really good or interesting, make for really interesting reading. And according to their 2022 report, in Africa, the most sort of prolific ransomware group, which, by the way, they were also most prolific in the rest of the world, is the Lockbit group. And if we look at the actors behind the Lockbit group, that's also quite, again, from a human point of view, I find it quite interesting, because the leader there seems to be quite a narcissistic, arrogant piece of work, if I can be polite. He's the types of, like, he or she, I assume it's a he, without being sexist, that person has given quite a few interviews and is quite sexist and sort of believes that he doesn't get caught, is very arrogant in the way he communicates, is a moderate drug user, a gamer, and passionate about and proud about the work that they do. Just to give you an indication of how big this person's ego is that they Lockbit launched a competition to create more, I guess, more awareness amongst the affiliates, where they said they will pay $1,000 for anyone who will tattoo their logo on themselves. And they had quite a few. If you go on GitHub, you can see all these these photos of these tattoos of people participating. So the other thing that I've thought was fascinating in terms of this character is that there's a really good researcher called John DiMaggio, and he infiltrated the Lockbit group quite a bit and then wrote a great report called the Ransomware Diaries. And when the Lockbit leader became aware of this, there's the comment that he released where he said, well, yeah, of course I read the whole report, but I was hoping there would be more photos of myself on a yacht with girls and marijuana. But there's just my post in a different format. How boring. And then what he did is he actually used John DiMaggio's profile picture, and used that as his own avatar on the Lockbit forum profile pic. So very much, I guess how would you describe this, like narcissistic, kind of arrogant behavior. And often that's actually their downfall. So sometimes when these criminals are too full of themselves or arrogant, that's how they make mistakes and get caught in the end. Another example of this arrogance that comes with some of these guys is this person that I introduced earlier, Matviev, that contractor that works for multiple groups. There's a $10 million fine or reward out that the American guys published. And when on the day that this was published, he posted a picture of himself with his new snakeskin pants. That's all he said to this. So often when these people, obviously, a lot of them are from Eastern European countries or Russia in particular, and they have this sort of agreement with the state that as long as they don't affect other Russian organizations and as long as they cooperate with the state, that they have sort of protection. And that gives them this sort of arrogant stance that they think they are untouchable and that law enforcement can't do anything to them. And this also, touches on the psychology behind, well, not just ransomware actors. I think this is all criminals. They have to motivate or argue in their own head that what they're doing is not bad. And the same applies to these groups. And they sort of, obviously they're in it for the money, but they also have this, what's called the neutralization effect that applies and can be seen even in the way their language or the words that they choose. To give you an example, they don't actually refer to their victims as victims. They see themselves as a service provider that does, deal with their customers, and then they offer a service when they help the customers out of the extortion or the ransom situation. So the language has already been used in quite a neutralized way. Obviously, they still very much conduct a crime, that's no question about it, but they see it, or they argue the fact that they're doing society a service by identifying these security vulnerabilities and helping companies become more secure. And then sometimes it's also it's pure fear. Some of the people are hired, they don't even know they're part of a syndicate, and they find out later on, and then they sort of either get offered more money or they're scared of leaving. And then there's this whole Robin Hood type thing that some of these groups are displaying, where they say, well, we don't attack certain industries or certain countries, and by the way, we're giving away parts of our takings for charitable purposes. So there's that other side to them as well, that again is just a mental exercise to argue that what they're doing is not actually as bad as it is. It is bad. And just by the way, also on the Lockbit side, it's been probably a month or so. So I don't know how they're looking like at the moment, but there's been quite a few issues on their side in terms of operational support, and the actual systems seem to. There's been issues that things didn't work, even though they threatened to expose files, they actually don't have the files. So I guess, like with any organization, there's also service delivery issues. And they, and the Lockbit specifically are going through some tough times, it seems. In terms of the victims that, again, the Orange Cyber Defense team has seen in Africa, the rest of the world, by the way, the biggest group that has been found on these shaming sites is in the manufacturing industry in Africa, which is also, it's a bit more limited in terms of the data that they see here. But what they have seen is that financial services and manufacturing are sort of the biggest industries affected, and then retail and professional services. So let's look at the IT web findings. So this was done in March this year, and we've actually done one of those exercises about 1.5 years ago as well. And back then, the number was 33%. In this survey, it was 18% of the participants admitting that they've been hit by a ransomware attack before, or even multiple times. And when asked how did they respond, 2% of the participants said that they paid the ransom. Now, you might say, well, 2%, that's actually not a lot, but that is a lot if you compare it to other, even legitimate direct marketing campaigns. If you have a 2% hit rate, that's pretty profitable, considering that it doesn't cost that much to, go out and infect environments within the context of an ecosystem that's already quite organized. So a 2% hit rate, considering that the fines are also quite, or not the fines, the ransom amounts are relatively high, is a pretty good return. And it probably is higher than what like it's probably higher across the whole country than what we've seen here in this limited view across about 200 participants. And then what we also asked, which was quite interesting, is we said, well, if you were attacked, so hypothetically, would your company pay the ransom to obtain the decryption key? And then total about 5% said yes, because it might be easier than going through the motions. And then 19% said maybe. And then when we asked, well, it's not just encrypting of data, so the potential loss of data, but there's also the what's just called double and triple extortion, where they exfiltrate your data and then they threaten to expose it. And then 9% of the participants said that they might pay in order to prevent this exposure from happening. And now this is quite, if you think about now we're moving from 2% to about 5 to 9%, it's an even higher return rate, and explains why it is so financially lucrative for these criminals to continue doing this. And then what was also interesting is we asked, well, how did you, if you were hit, what were the original root causes that allowed the ransomware to gain access into your environment? And you can see here that password issues or stolen credentials most probably, and social engineering, followed by unpatched software and misconfiguration were sort of the top reasons of how, or the top root causes of how these criminals got in. And this is pretty much confirmed by all sorts of other reports, that the initial intrusion is, in most cases, starts with either like a stolen credential or password issues, where somebody gets access to somebody's account, or through social engineering, like your typical phishing, but then also in recent past, combination where they try and steal people's multi-factor authentication through a sort of over the phone phishing attacks, or so proper social engineering, human manipulation, or through externally available gateways that have vulnerabilities, such as often VPN gateways, by the way, or even security gateways that are misconfigured or have some sort of vulnerabilities. And then also obviously your Microsoft RDP, something that's misconfigured there or allowing access. And then once they're in the environment, like I said earlier on, so you may have a list, or these operators may have a list of compromised credentials, for example. Then they go through the list, they choose the organization, they get in, and then they try as a first step to move laterally, escalate their privileges, find the backup accounts, find an administrator account, really raise their sort of privileges, and then start the what's called the leverage. Like the more pressure they can put on an organization, the more power they have to extort more money. So they will try and exfiltrate the data, and or encrypt the data, and possibly even add additional pressure points, such as denial of service attacks, onto the overall extortion scheme. And once that's done, they will then start the negotiation process. And why social engineering and this whole sort of the use of human credentials still such a large component of this attack chain? Well, because it is still easier to hack humans than trying to break through technology. And some of the just sharing some of the examples of these campaigns. This is, by the way, that what the North Koreans have used this Operation Dream Job campaign quite successfully. That's how they got into Axie Infinity, by the way, which was that $500 million crypto heist that they did successfully. So they tricked one of the main developers of that company, or that organization, by offering an amazing job in one of the competitive organizations. So they reach out via LinkedIn. They then rope the person into some sort of trust or rapport, up to the point where they then share their email address and then open up an attachment, which is the job offer, whatever the details. And then obviously that's a loaded attachment with some piece of malware, and they take over the machine. So that's one way of getting in. Obviously all sorts of traditional phishing mechanisms that you would have come across, but then also which is a good example You may have seen the news that I think it was about a month ago now, maybe 2 months, I can't remember, that in Las Vegas, 2 of the massive casino hotel chains, including Caesar's Palace, were hit by ransomware actors, and they got in by tricking the help desk into they called the help desk pretending they're an employee that needed to reset their OTP, and that's how they got into that particular employee's machine, and then obviously from there moved, like, did the typical sort of lateral movement. And I think the scary part that we need to be aware of is that with ChatGPT and AI and all this cool stuff, the criminals can also, they don't necessarily have to yet, because it's still quite they're still quite effective to do it the old school way, but they definitely are automating a lot of their attacks, and the generative AI tools, particularly the ones that are available on the underground, allow them to create much more sophisticated and sort of researched social engineering attacks that are personalized to the target. And in fact, we've actually done a test internally. It can even be used to have a two-way conversation with the target, driven by an agenda, in order to manipulate them. So it's just something to keep in mind, that the bad guys have access to the same tools that we have access to, and are using it. Here was one case, I think we've published a blog post about that, where the criminals sent an SMS to about 30 people in an organization, trying to trick them into validating their credentials. Only one of those 30 clicked on the link, and then as he was prompted to enter his MFA details, he stopped. So he didn't do it, but then got a phone call from the IT department, which obviously wasn't the IT department, but the criminals using deepfake technology to impersonate the IT administrator's voice, and then tricking the employee to entering the OTPs, and voila, obviously then that allowed the criminal to get into the environment. And that's really where deepfake technology is being used more and more by these criminals, whether that's through these kind of techniques that I've just explained, where they impersonate the IT department or somebody within the company. Also quite successful in business email compromises, where they impersonate, let's say, an executive to instruct somebody else to do a payment or authorize a payment. Something that I thought was quite interesting recently, that in fact, only yesterday I read sort of a case study about a lady whose identity was being misused by a criminal who recreated a fake version of that person's face or video content, to then use it in a job interview. And then the person actually landed the job in that other lady's name, got access to the environment, obviously stole whatever information they wanted to steal, and then disappeared. And then the company was reached out to the real person, saying, hey, where are you? You didn't pitch up for work. And she wasn't even aware that somebody that used her identity and used her look and feel got the job in her name. So that's quite scary, if we consider the possibilities and how easy it is nowadays to recreate deepfake versions of both voice and video. I'm sure many of you would have come across that so-called grandparent scam, where the scammers impersonate a family member, pretending that this child or the friend is in distress or in some sort of trouble. That's been around for a long time, a couple of years on WhatsApp already. But now the scary thing is that by using deepfake technology, we've seen how they are using the same scam, but with the added sort of impersonation of the voice file. And that's obviously very powerful in terms of manipulation and getting people to be emotional. The worst thing I've seen, by the way, just recently, is this virtual abduction, where they pretend they've abducted or kidnapped your child and then recreate the voice of the child being abducted. So that's disgusting, but unfortunately that's a reality, and we need to be aware of that and talk to our families, I suppose, about this. Okay, so what can we do about it? Prevention, I suppose, with anything in security, there's not one silver bullet. I wish I could say, oh, you just put this in place or buy this product, but unfortunately that's not how it works. It's all about sort of defense and depth and doing layered security and being aware of the threat. Funny enough, the Conti group, once they had a paying customer, they usually gave advice in terms of how to help that customer to prevent the customer or the organization from falling victim again. And this is what some of the advice that they've shared, quite common sense, like restricting access or restricting privileged access, using different passwords, pretty sort of standard user awareness or security awareness content, installing EDR at every endpoint, and they even suggested some companies there, etc. I think that what we typically say is, well, you have to have a bit more of a sort of holistic approach. It's very important to bring your people into the program, like particularly with this deepfake technology. There isn't a detection mechanism on the market just yet that can do real-time deepfake detection. There are some efforts on the way where you can detect it after the fact, but not in real time, and even the after sort of detection is not 100% foolproof. So at the moment, or as it stands today, there isn't a technology, unless I'm being mistaken. It's just this, this everything changes so quickly. But as far as I know, we don't have a technology in place yet that can detect deepfakes. So it's the onus is very much on us, the people, to be mindful and apply critical thinking when and if we receive messages that look legitimate, that sound legitimate, and yet we still have to verify, particularly when it is about something such as authorizing payments or opening up attachments that could be infected, etc. So it's very important to bring the user on board and build the security training and culture across the organization. Obviously, invest in sort of gateway security to prevent the malicious communication coming in the first place, patching. Particularly, I think what's very important is to pay attention to your externally accessible gateways, or your VPN gateways, your firewalls. Ironically, often the security tools are actually being exploited by these criminals, so we have to pay extra attention to patch those systems and configure them appropriately. EDR, multi-factor authentication. There's actually something we use as internally where it's termed phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication. We use these sort of UV keys, so going back to old school, in a way, old school hardware tokens. And then, obviously having a good backup strategy in place and segmenting the network. And I think that the biggest best practice, or the most important best practice, is to actually go through the motion of doing a walkthrough, a simulated sort of attack. So you identify, if and when this happens, what do you do? Like, who do you call? Who do you communicate with? How do you communicate with? And what is your strategy? So it's quite important to proactively plan for this. And even if you just start off with a sort of walkthrough exercise to come up with your incident response plan, it might become apparent that you maybe don't have somebody on call that you might call if something happens. So it's very important to do that planning, to not be caught with your pants down when it happens. And hopefully it will never happen, but rather be prepared. And then I guess, like, this is always my biggest or most important recommendation when it comes to particularly end users, is to really apply critical thinking and being mindful, because a lot of the time, whether that's a standard phishing email or even a deep fake kind of manipulative piece of content, they will try and appeal to our emotions to get us to do something that we wouldn't usually. So as soon as we receive something that triggers an emotion, whether it's positive or negative, it could be flattery as well, like this job offer, that's a sign that we might be getting manipulated. So, it's just very important to appeal to people's critical thinking and basically there's the saying, trust but verify. I think we should have the saying, don't trust and verify. Like, you literally can't trust anything anymore. And this world that where truth becomes like the number one thing that we can't trust anymore, is to be very, very vigilant. And then maybe even within the families, have like a secret code or passphrase that you share, that should somebody, even though they sound and look like part of your friends or family group, should they ask for financial help, to only do that if they have the passcode or the secret passphrase. And there's a bunch of reference and supporting material that I can also maybe share in the chat somehow. Like, we have a couple of white papers and even sort of ransomware playbooks. Then the CISA, the American, that's their government unit for information security. They always publish great material on how to be aware of the latest ransomware and cyber extortion attacks. So there's a lot out there. As I mentioned, the Orange Cyber Defense team, they publish great reports on a quarterly basis. So I would check that one out. And then just in closing, I think being located in South Africa or in Africa, unfortunately, makes us more vulnerable, because the criminals do know that we don't have the same resources from a national defense point of view like the Americans have. And we do speak a language that they can easily communicate with. We speak English. And at the end of the day, it's a business, right? So they have to still negotiate with their targets or their victims. And it's easier for them to do that in a language and in a culture that they understand. That's why you don't see that many cases maybe in Japan or in other regions where it's more difficult for these groups to communicate, first of all. So unfortunately, our English speaking culture, the westernized culture, and the fact that we are in an area that is highly cyber dependent on the one side, but then also doesn't have the same security infrastructure in place as the more developed countries, makes us puts us in the firing line. So we need to really be aware of this. I mentioned that it's still quite opportunistic. So preparing for this can only be done by proper rigorous defense in depth, using multiple layers of controls, and then I can't stress this enough, like the testing and the setting up of the incident response plans. And yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you so much again for listening in and for the opportunity. I don't know if there's time for questions. You're also welcome to always reach out to me on LinkedIn, or this should be X right now. It's no longer Twitter. Thanks so much for having me.
No, thank you very much, Anna. We really appreciate the time you allocated to us to speaking today. I don't see that there were any specific questions asked, nor were there anything mentioned in the chat. But thank you once again, and hope we can do this sometime again in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Kobus, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.